My name is Shannon Jones. I'm the Executive Director of the Scott S. Cowen Institute for Public Education Initiatives, otherwise known as the Cowen Institute. And myself and my staff, we're here tonight, and we're here to talk to you a little bit about what's going on really since Katrina, but mostly in the past year. Since the storm, there have been so many changes in public schools. We have, most of our students today are in charter schools. We have new teachers from everywhere around the country. We have new teachers that are veteran teachers, but we have a really large population of teachers that are young teachers. We have students that are in new buildings, many that are not. And so what we wanted to talk to you about today is not only what's going on in the public schools, but really about how you can get involved. The Cowen Institute opened our doors about 3 years ago, March 2007, so we just celebrated our 3-year anniversary. Our role, as we see it, is really the think tank role on one side of the business, and so we spend a lot of our time talking to journalists, talking to community members, talking to policymakers about what's really going on. We can serve as that objective voice. We also draft, analyze, and advance policy and legislative solutions. It's pretty unique for a university to actually be drafting and advancing policy and legislation. And so our areas of focus in the policy world are really three. They're funding, facilities, and governance. And so you'll see why that's important when you look at the film in the presentation. But if you drive around the city and you look at any school building, or if you stepped into a school building, I don't need to tell you why it's important that we focus on school facilities. We've also implemented college courses, or college level courses, in 4 high schools, and now we've just expanded to another 3. That means currently, right now, we have over 300 students in the past 2 years that have been offered college-level courses, advanced placement courses in English, math, and science. It's the first time these students have ever been offered these classes and these opportunities. We've built science labs, we've added books to libraries, and we've brought Tulane students, maybe many of you, that have actually gone into these schools and served as lab assistants, tutors, mentors. And so last year we had about 3,000 Tulane students involved in public schools. We're hoping that we can double that each year. A little difficult, but that's our goal. We also have a whole area of the Institute that's called university-based programming. And the reason we have that is so that we can get Tulaneans involved in a variety of ways. It's not just volunteer opportunities. There are really concrete research projects that need to be done. There are questions that still are not answered. We know what they are, but we simply don't have the staff or the capacity to answer all of them. So should you be research faculty here, should you be a student who's interested in doing that research work, we would love to hear from you. And so we have information on the back, the table back there. When you leave, please talk to one of our staff members. Everyone has a name tag on. You'll know who we are. Everyone knows about the projects, school-based projects, nonprofit projects, or projects with us at the Institute. So before I talk more, which I'm very likely to do, I'm going to hand it over to Michael Bayard, who's our Assistant Director of Research. Michael is actually a product of the public school system in New Orleans. He went to Lusher High School, which is or Lusher Elementary, sorry, Michael, which is around the corner from Tulane. Michael went to Oxford to get his master's degree, and he went to Cornell to get his undergraduate degree. He's actually leaving us this summer to go get his PhD, which we're very, very sad about. But should you be interested in replacing Michael, you can look on our website and find his job description. No, in honesty, Michael is one of the brightest people I know. Even President Cowen says he's in that top 2%, and so you actually have someone really phenomenal in front of you talking about what's taking place and analyzing what's taking place. And so I'll hand it over to Michael.
Well, thank you very much. That's very kind. Thank you all for coming today. What I want to do today is talk about the research that we did and some of the conclusions we came to in the report, which is available outside. And I want to say before I get started that our report is as much as possible about the system of schools, public schools in New Orleans. There are a bunch of very important things, successes, challenges, interesting things happening in individual schools, which this report does not capture. That doesn't mean they're not important. It just means it's not what we were going after as we were trying to describe this system for the public. So I just want to get that message out there. Very briefly, this is going to go? There we go. What we did as we were trying to assess this system of public schools in New Orleans is we looked at a variety of types of data and collected a variety of types of data. There's a lot of quantitative data available from the state of Louisiana and from other sources that we used in this report, and you'll see some of it here. We also did a number of interviews with school leaders and also school advocates, stakeholders, community leaders, as a way to get their input about what's going on in public schools right now. Importantly, probably most importantly, we spoke to about a third of the public school principals in New Orleans, and they were pretty well representative of the different types of schools in the city: charter and non-charter, recovery school district and non. We also did a comprehensive survey or opinion poll of voters and public school parents in New Orleans, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And then to fill in some things, we also relied on media reports. And I will say some of this I will go through somewhat quickly, and I'd like to leave a fair amount of time for questions, so if there's something I don't cover, please feel free to ask me about it at the end. So very briefly, before Katrina, the public schools in New Orleans looked a lot like the public schools everywhere. Most public school districts have an elected school board, as we did at the Orleans Parish School Board. But the important thing to know is that many of the structures and types of schools that would become more prominent after the storm already existed pre-storm, and these include charter schools and the recovery school district. So very briefly, Bessie up here, excuse me, I don't want to get out of the mic, is the State Board of Education. And the state legislature created the recovery school district in 2003 before the storm as a mechanism for taking over schools that were failing according to the state guidelines, according to the state performance standards. And so the recovery school district existed before the storm. It had taken over a school in New Orleans. It was about to take over more, and it had turned those schools into charter schools, which was its main plan for turning around failing schools. Very briefly, usually this is more of a back and forth, but in case you're not familiar with it, a charter school in Louisiana is an independently run organization, in most cases a nonprofit with its own board, that receives public monies to run a public school, but is in fact a private organization. And it has additional flexibility to hire teachers, to set curriculum, but it's still bound by the Louisiana Common Curriculum, and it still takes all the same tests. Its students take all the same tests, and it's assessed by the same accountability system as a normal public school, just to give you a quick sense of it. At the same time, the Orleans Parish School Board also had several charter schools. Now, when you think about what was going through the minds of state lawmakers when Katrina hit and really decimated the school system, you have to think a little bit about a few of the major issues that were happening just before the storm in New Orleans. Some of you were here, some of you who were not were following it in the news like myself, but there were a few key things to remember. There were ongoing financial problems with the OPSB, and there were significant corruption probes at the OPSB. And including among the financial problems were the fact that the OPSB, just before the storm, was essentially declared broke. They had no reserves, and they were likely to essentially run out of money. And the state actually insisted that their finances be turned over to an outside entity. There were drawn-out conflicts with the current superintendent at the time, and there was ongoing low school performance, though in some cases there were improvements before the storm in school performance. Okay, so then the storm hit, and legislators in the state was faced with some options. They could reconstitute the system under the Orleans Parish School Board, or they could do something different. And through a variety of ways, the different path was taken. And I won't go into all of that, we can talk about it more afterwards. The main reforms following the storm were the following. The state used the recovery school district as a way to take over the vast majority of schools in New Orleans. And it did it by school performance. So essentially all of the lowest performing schools, in this case the schools that were under the state average for performance, were taken over by the state. The state and the Orleans Parish School Board then used chartering as a way to reopen schools, and also as for the RSD as a school turnaround method. So there was a broad expansion of charter schools. At the same time, somewhat by default in the beginning, but also eventually as a conscious reform, schools had school choice. And what this means is that in the old days, for the most part, with some exceptions, you went to school based on where you lived. A school had an attendance zone. For the most part, all schools in New Orleans can now be attended by students who live anywhere in the city. A few of them have additional selective admissions, academic requirements, but in terms of where you live, almost no schools have any kind of attendance zone anymore. There's a few small exceptions to that. The other thing that happened was when the schools were taken over and the school board had run out of money and it realized it was not going to be bailed out by the state or get all of its schools back, it fired all of its teachers and its staff. And as a result of that, though some of those teachers were rehired in the reconstituted Orleans Parish School Board schools and in the Recovery School District schools, a number of new teachers were also brought in through teacher recruitment programs like Teach for America, which you're probably familiar with, as well as others. So these are the major reforms, and I'll speed up a little bit. And the new system looks like this. It's essentially all of the pieces of the old system, but radically reshaped. The vast majority of schools are now under the state-run Recovery School District and are either charter schools or direct-run schools, though charter schools are now the majority. When it comes to the Orleans Parish School Board, they only run a small number of schools, just 4 right now, and they have 12 charter schools. And many of the highest performing schools, some of which had selective admissions, like Lusher and Ben Franklin, are now Orleans Parish charter schools. And there are these additional charter schools as well, which we can go into if you're interested. The other thing to note is that we have about 38,000 students now, compared to 65,000 before the storm. Okay, so probably one of the biggest stories in New Orleans is the rise of charter schools, and with them came a number of charter networks, which organize schools together, allow them to share services in some cases, and also share expertise. And these are just some of them, so you can see what they are. You might be familiar with the KIPP network, which is actually a national network of which there is a local affiliate. And then there's some local ones like the UNO Charter School Network, which is run in affiliation with the University of New Orleans. What you can see is that the public school population was pretty decimated by the storm and came back at, in the first full year after the storm at about 1/3. And since then it's risen, but its rate of increase has declined to some extent. And most long-term projections put it at about maybe 45,000 for the next 5 years or so. So that's not to say it couldn't change rapidly, but that's sort of what we're seeing right now. The biggest story is obviously the number of students in charter schools. Over 60% of public school students are now in charter schools. This is the highest of any major school system in the country. The next highest is Washington, D.C. at about 30 to 33%. And this is likely to increase to about 70%, if not more, within 2 years. So this is very much the direction of reform in New Orleans. One thing that you're probably familiar with, but it's worth talking about, is the level of student poverty in schools in New Orleans. Free and reduced lunch is one way of measuring low income, the sort of percentage of low income students. Students who are eligible for free and reduced lunch are actually over the poverty line, but not by a whole lot, and I can go into the details if you're interested. The main thing to note is that in New Orleans as a whole, 82% of students are eligible for free and reduced lunch. The Louisiana average is about 66%. The national average, which is not up here, is about 41%. So we're at about double of the national average in terms of student poverty. And across the different school types, you'll see that the schools taken over by the state, the Recovery School District schools, have the highest rates of poverty, but certainly all of the school types are at the state average or above in most cases. When we talk about charter schools, even the open access charter schools, which are all of the RSD charter schools and about half of the Orleans Parish charter schools, there's often a conversation about special education because nationally, charter schools tend to enroll fewer students with disabilities, that's what special education means here, than traditional schools. And there's a variety of reasons for that that I can't exactly suss out for New Orleans, but they relate to the way schools are funded and also can relate to parent self-selection and also school selection, whether overt or more subtle. It's often hard to figure out why the rates are different, but it's important to see that they are in New Orleans. Within the Orleans Parish school system, that's the case, and within the Recovery School District system, that's the case. When we did a public opinion poll of voters and parents, we asked them about the major reforms following the storm, about the state takeover, charter schools, school choice, and new teachers. And what we found is that the majority of parents and the majority of voters support, to various extents, but in most cases it's a majority, or in all cases it's a majority, and in some cases it's a large majority, support the major reforms. What's interesting that came out of our poll is that at the same time, only a plurality, so not a majority, but the largest group, think that schools are better since Hurricane Katrina. There's a smaller percentage that think schools were better before Katrina, and the largest group are people who are not sure or neutral. And I think this is an interesting indicator because I think it shows that people are optimistic about the direction of reform, but don't seem convinced that we're where we need to be. And I think a lot of what I show you next will convince you that that's probably true. So just to dive in a little bit, the other thing we did was we asked school leaders and we asked school advocates, what are the biggest problems you face? And what I'm going to do now is dive in a little bit on what those largest challenges were, or what were other areas where, even if people weren't talking to us about it as much, we see major challenges in the future. So school facilities, some of you are students in public schools in New Orleans, some of you teach in them, you're all familiar with them. School facilities in New Orleans have been a problem for a long time, and the storm just made that worse. What was interesting to me is that when we talked to school leaders, after people talked about the challenges that students bring with them, the academic deficits, the socio and behavioral and emotional problems from Katrina and so on, the biggest challenges that school leaders say they face was the quality of school facilities. And it's interesting when you talk to a school leader about how a school facility limits what they can do. Now, there's kind of two aspects to this. One is just the basic quality of the schools. The other is that in the current system, it's often unclear where a school will be in the following year. This is especially the case for charter schools, which have been moved frequently from school to school for a variety of reasons. Partly it's because some schools are being renovated and others are not. Partly it's because they're growing by a grade each year and have new seat requirements. There's a lot of reasons, but in most cases there's not a lot of predictability about where they're going to go. So in the long term, school facilities or the issues around school facilities are relatively optimistic. The state and the school board have approved a school facilities master plan, which is likely to be fully funded by FEMA, though it's not fully funded now. And that would invest pretty much an unprecedented amount for New Orleans in public school facilities, about $1.8 billion. In the short term, there's an ongoing problem about where schools will be. School leaders don't know, and it's very difficult for them to plan for their schools. And this is kind of a typical quote from a charter school leader about not knowing both who owns the school and who is in charge of repairing it, and also about where they're going to be and for how long. Very briefly, and we can talk about this more later, the school facilities master plan was adopted in '08. It's only partly funded by FEMA, though there is the likelihood that it will be fully funded. And it should rebuild or renovate about 80 schools, which is all the schools that the school system anticipates will be used for the next 10 years or so. One problem is accountability. Both the RSD, or the state I should say, and the Orleans Parish School Board are accountable for the plan. As I'll talk about in a minute, they don't always see eye to eye or get along very well. And they did create a facilities oversight committee to sort of watch over the plan, but that committee has not really been empowered to do very much so far. So as I said, another major reform is school choice. And students can now apply to schools from anywhere in the city. However, there are some schools that have additional admission requirements, usually academic requirements. On the other hand, Recovery School District runs, so all the state schools, RSD run, RSD charters have to be open admissions. And when talking about charters, people often refer to selectivity, and there's different types of selectivity. But it's important to note that it's a small number of schools, both charter and non-charter, that have overt selective admissions that have established GPAs you need to meet or tests you need to meet. And those are the schools in red. So when we asked parents about school choice, they were very, very supportive of school choice, perhaps not surprisingly. What's very interesting and also perhaps not surprising is that parents also want access to neighborhood schools. And of course, if you asked a parent, do you want access to your neighborhood school and do you want school choice, they would probably say yes to both. The problem is creating a policy that allows both whenever someone wants it is very difficult. And what we're seeing is that, as you see at the bottom, about a third of parents would like to send, at least according to our poll, would like to send their child to their neighborhood school, but they were not able to. And when you have a system of school choice where people are admitted into schools based on a lottery, simply being in the neighborhood gives you no advantage. So the school could become full, your name doesn't get pulled in the lottery, and so even though you live across the street, you can't go to that school. And so what we see is while a lot of people want to use the choice and do use it, just living near, I guess I should say, the old system in which you were essentially guaranteed a spot in your neighborhood school is no longer the case, and that is troubling for some. It also, as I'll show in a minute, relates to the expense of the new system, because a lot of students are being transported by bus now that used to be able to walk. And so when we talk about school funding, this kind of came up as the second biggest challenge that a lot of school leaders and then also district administrators talked about. And I'll talk a little bit about why. So on a macro level, when you look at how much, and typically when you talk about school expenditures, you talk about per pupil to make it comparable since there's fewer kids now. Before the storm, New Orleans was spending on all of its public schools about the same as the state average. Post-Katrina, there was several influxes of cash, which I'll talk about, but the ultimate outcome was that we're spending a lot more per pupil than we were before the storm, and it's a lot more than the Louisiana average. Now, there were a few big chunks of money that came in. There was a large chunk of what's called restart aid from the federal government, which went mostly to the districts. There was a smaller pot of federal monies for charter schools, to restart charter schools or to expand current charter schools. And then, as you're probably aware, there was some philanthropic money that came in for a variety of purposes. It's hard to quantify all the philanthropic money, but we do have a sense of the size of the other ones. Now, what's happening in school finances is that these are all one-time monies. They're not recurring monies. They came in once to help schools get started and restart, as they're called, after the storm. And so the one-time federal monies are dwindling. They were used up relatively quickly to restart schools, to resupply them, to train teachers, to pay teachers. And at the same time, as you probably know, we're in a budget crisis. So the typical state and local portion of school funding, which is the largest part of it, is pretty much flat, and it might actually decline next year. It's unclear. And at the same time, as I'll talk about in a minute, there are certain structural issues like transportation in this new system of choice, which makes it hard to find savings in this type of public school system. So one thing that we're very concerned about, and certainly many district administrators and charter schools are concerned about, is that the districts, and to the lesser extent, but to some extent the charter schools, are used to a certain level of funding that might not be able to be maintained. One thing that's important to note is that a lot of money has flowed through this system, and typically when talking about charter schools, and sometimes this is the case in other places, people sometimes assume that charter schools have more money to spend than district schools. And actually in New Orleans, this has not been the case to date. I can't predict the future, but so far the districts have gotten the lion's share of the federal monies. And as you've seen, they educate more special education students. There might be reasons why they need more money, but to date, they have not, charter schools have not had more to spend than district schools. And this just shows you a basic breakdown of spending per pupil on something like teacher salaries, which is a main sort of instructional expenditure within the RSD. So one of the major sources of increased cost post-storm is obviously transportation, and that's because students are now traveling to school from all over the city. A lot of school leaders, especially charter school leaders who are all independently paying for transportation, talk about the huge hole this leaves in their budget. So an example is there's a lot of new charter schools that are budgeting at about 10% of their whole budget just for busing. A national average is like 3 to 4%. So that's a huge amount of money that's not going into the classroom, that's not going to teacher salaries or aides, that's just going into buses. There's some possibility for better coordination among schools to improve busing, but to some extent, if you're going to have a system of full school choice, you're always going to have to pay a lot for busing. And one thing that we're thinking about and that other people are thinking about is that if there really are a lot of parents who would prefer to go to their neighborhood schools, there might be a way to kind of find a compromise between pure school choice and a pure neighborhood school to allow those parents to go to those schools and save money in the process. And this gives a sense of how district budgets, what percentage of them are now being spent on transportation versus pre-Katrina. This is for charter schools. I won't go into this as much, but I think these numbers are actually a little lowballed due to some accounting issues. But in most RSD charters, it's actually closer to about 6 or 7% this year. So the other major reform I talked about is human capital, and especially the influx of new teachers, and to a lesser extent, but it's also important, the influx of new principals who came into the system. You're probably familiar with Teach for America and also the new Teacher Project, which are teacher recruitment and training programs. And in the first years of the Recovery School District post-storm, they relied very heavily on Teach for America. And in the 07-08, I believe it was the 07-08 year, about 60% of their teachers had 0 to 1 year of experience. So were either brand new teachers or had 1 year of experience under their belt. Now, we know that's changed now, and actually RSD schools, this can get a little complex to read, but this shows the breakdown of teacher experience across the different types of schools. And what you see is that in the old Orleans Parish run schools, those 4 schools, they're made up almost exclusively of veteran teachers, over 60% of 20 or more years of experience. Whereas in Recovery School District charter schools, there's still a heavy reliance on very new teachers. And when you see the RSD run schools, that blue bar there, I'm colorblind, so I believe it's blue, used to be 60%, and it's actually declined quite a lot. We're not entirely sure what that's about, but actually when we spoke to the Recovery School District, they said that they're now allowing their principals to do site selection. So the principals themselves are selecting the teachers, and they seem to be selecting more veteran teachers as a result. One other thing we looked at that we just sort of created was principal turnover. And what we see is very different rates across the different types of schools. We're not exactly completely sure what that's about, but we thought it was interesting, so we threw it in there. All right, so when you talk to district administrators and charter school leaders about the successes of the system, they typically talk about increasing student achievement. And kind of the good story coming out of New Orleans, even though we have a lot of these ongoing challenges around facilities and funding and so on, is that student achievement has continued to increase, though you should understand from a very low baseline. One way to think about this is in terms of the percentage of schools that are considered academically unacceptable. So schools are given a label by the state based on the aggregate of their test scores that either puts them in an academically unacceptable range or gives them a certain label, 1 to 5 stars. It's always stars in schools. Before the storm in 2005, 64% of schools in New Orleans were considered academically unacceptable, compared to a state average of about 8% or so. Something like I don't remember the percentage, but the largest grouping of schools, of academically unacceptable schools, in fact, possibly the majority, were in Orleans Parish. Post-storm, in terms of proportions, that proportion has declined, pretty precipitously to 42%, and a number of schools have kind of moved up the ranking levels, including a lot of open access schools. But this compares to 5% average across the state in terms of the number of academically unacceptable schools. So this is progress, but not anywhere near where a city would hope to be, is sort of what I take away from this. You might often hear about the LEAP, the school performance scores which determine a school's label are made up of the aggregate of various tests like these that are given in grades 3 through 10, I believe. So these are passage rates of the LEAP in 4th grade. And you can see that before the storm, there was some increase, and it's continued to increase post-storm. In some of the higher grades, there was less movement before the storm. This is 8th grade, and this is high school GEE. And actually, there has been some recent progress in high school passage rates, but in general, we still have about 50% of students who aren't passing the very basic high school graduate exit exam. When you talk to school leaders about why their schools are improving, since they do feel like they're improving, the biggest thing they talk about is the change in school culture and student expectations. So creating a culture of learning and creating very high expectations for students. When you get sort of past that, and you will see as you go into schools over time that they do seem to be both more orderly and more learning is happening. Some schools also talk about starting to focus more on good instruction and on data-driven decision-making, so using a lot of data about student knowledge to tailor lessons and so on. These are kind of the biggest things we hear from school leaders. I want to talk briefly before I get to the end about governance. This is not something that necessarily comes up a lot when you talk to a school leader, but it's something where we see a lot of problems. Governance after the storm, and I should define governance, these are as we have it, the authority, the roles and responsibilities of the people and the organizations in the system. So it's essentially who does what. And this is something that has often been very confusing post-storm. If you talk to anyone about who's in charge of what, they say, I don't know. I don't know if I go to the school board or to the Recovery School District or to a charter board for any given number of questions. And part of the reason for that is actually in some cases it's not well defined. This lack of clarity we feel about roles and responsibilities means that there are gaps in the system, things that aren't getting taken care of. We asked voters and parents what kind of governance they might be interested in having And when I say this type of governance, it's sort of like what kind of macro body would they be interested in having that would govern the system of schools, which is now divided between charters and also between the two districts. Voters in November were not interested in mayoral involvement, which might not come as a huge surprise, but this is something that has been done in New York, in Boston, in Chicago, and is, one approach that cities are taking. Voters also generally were against returning control to the OPSB. And at the same time, voters did want some sort of elected say in school governance. And the most popular choice was actually a citywide board that would be elected citywide versus by district. But it would be a new board, so not the old board. It's unclear what that means exactly, but that's what voters wanted, and parents as well. So the kind of conclusion we take is obviously we are making progress. We do feel we're making progress, but we face a number of challenges. And some of the progress we've made has been built on very welcome resources, but resources that aren't going to be able to sustain themselves going forward. Just briefly, the top successes we've seen based on our research is as I talked about, sort of undergirding the improved achievement is improved school culture and increased expectations for students, and then obviously a new focus on instruction in some schools and on student learning, where that wasn't really happening before. We're also seeing important progress on facilities planning and construction. And this is something that we saw in the past that I didn't highlight here, but we're seeing improving relationships between charters and their districts. The charter-district relationship is often quite fraught. There's tensions around resources, around rules, but that does seem to be improving. And finally, one thing that really hurt New Orleans, we believe, before the storm was that there was a lot of turnover of superintendents and leadership at the central office. And for all the challenges the current leaders of the two districts have, and at the state level and at some of the schools, there has been more sustained leadership after the storm, which we think is a good thing. Now, here are what we see as the major challenges, and we can probably talk about this more as soon as this is over. Obviously, in addition to the progress we're making on facilities remain a huge challenge, and there's not a lot of transparency about where people are going to go or how projects are going to be prioritized as the master plan moves forward. So we really want to see those prioritizing policies put into place, and we want to ensure that the oversight committee can do its work. The other main thing we're worried about is that though a lot of this FEMA money can be used to build facilities, we still haven't located a source of funding to maintain facilities, which was the big problem before the storm. And so if we don't maintain the beautiful new buildings we're building, and many of them are beautiful, and you should go see the Wilson School and some of the other new schools, we could be in a similar situation 20 years down the road. A close second is the financial sustainability of the school system. There's not a whole lot we can do in terms of the one-time money that's going away. There's certain types of economies of scale we might be able to build through more coordination between schools. If we can amend the choice system slightly and make savings in transportation, that might make some difference. But a lot of this is going to be trying to maintain the advances that have been made with fewer resources, at least for the next year or two, while the budget crisis goes on. And there's not really a solution to this one. We do see governance as a problem, as I mentioned. And though we don't necessarily see a rush to move back to local control, we do think that there needs to be a process that's put in place on how that's going to happen. Because right now there's just a lot of uncertainty about what the future is going to look like for schools. And that makes it both difficult for schools to plan, but I think it also builds a certain amount of distrust among the public that they don't really know what's going to happen with their schools. Researchers always throw this in. This is sort of a perennial complaint of researchers, but we do see it as a problem. There's a lot of lack of data about schools that would be useful for accountability, for answering a lot of questions that I get every day that I don't have access to and that other people don't have access to. These relate to questions about student mobility, about what happens to students with disabilities. Do they get moved from school to school? How do they end up in a particular school, and where did they come from? So there's a lot of questions related to equity, finances, and so on that we really can't answer without better data. And then in this new, more divided system of schools, there's also a lot of information about schools, just sort of public information like school charters or meeting times that are sort of essential for the public to be involved that aren't easily available. And we think that's a problem, especially when you're trying to build public trust in a new system. And finally, this is something I didn't talk about a lot, but the two districts don't get along very well, and this is a problem. as I understand it, they're currently in litigation over some insurance proceeds, I believe. And there's periodic disagreements about funding. And their funding is intertwined, so it's not surprising that this happens, but at least for the short term, while this bifurcated system is in place, this is a problem because it's hard to make progress on facilities planning, on funding planning, on governance planning without a working relationship between these two entities, one local and one state. So that's a big problem. This is our website if you have any questions or would like to contact me or any of my colleagues. We do try to be a resource to the public, to journalists, to academics, to educators, to whomever is interested. So please do contact us if you're interested. And I think we still have plenty of time, so we'd be happy to take any questions you have. And some of my colleagues know a lot more than I do about certain things, so they might answer too, if I don't know.
I have a lot of more. I'm a child psychiatrist.
Okay.
And I applaud your efforts on the school system because I work with this day in and day out trying to get adequate services for kids. However, my population are special ed children by far. And Orleans Parish School System is woefully inadequate in addressing the needs of special ed children, whether it be RSD or the traditional school system with the Orleans Parish School System. They also blatantly defy federal regulations and their own state regulations, moving kids from school, calling parents to pick up kids who are disruptive. And we've had to call the state superintendent a couple of times because of the blatant disregard for schools, school rules, and federal mandates for special ed kids. Charter schools are worse. They will tell parents, we do not have the facilities, we do not have the teachers, we do not have the programs to support your special ed kids' needs in our school. And so they are shunted off to whatever school the parents can get their kids in. High schools are atrocious. You cannot get special ed services for high school students unless they are severely impaired with profound severe mental retardation or severe autistic spectrum disorder. This has to be addressed. It's a huge challenge. And it's going to be even more with the financial restrictions that have been placed on school systems now. Nobody wants a special ed kid because they are exquisitely expensive. What are you going to do about that?
Well, I will say briefly, and then perhaps the audience will answer the audience. We have some basic aggregate data about where special ed kids are and to some extent what their exceptionalities are. But we have, to be perfectly honest, we have no expertise in special ed or special ed policy, and so we try to, ask other people for their opinions on that and what they think. I do think that when you have this system of funding, where funding follows the kid, it can be very powerful for certain types of schools, but it also makes it hard when the funding isn't adequate and you can't centralize services for very expensive to educate and serve children. And that's something that hasn't been well figured out. All of the other things you talk about are things that I hear a lot. I don't have an answer for them. It's certainly something that needs to be addressed. But did you want to speak to the special ed question? Okay, can you grab the mic? It would just help because they also wanted to tape this.
I know what the problem is for that. The state has MFPs set aside for the different exceptionalities. And for instance, an autistic kid is supposed to have 2.5 of what a regular ed kid would have. But there is no law that the district has to implement that. And I asked Dan Smith at a board meeting whether the money follows the child, and he blatantly said no. So the money, because of charter law, every public school student is paid less than their counterpart charter school student in the eyes of OPSB. That's what Dan Smith said, which means that the money that the state sends the local district doesn't get a portion to the child.
That's in OPSB charter schools?
No, well,
Where is that? Because that doesn't apply to RSD schools, so.
no, that's just within, well, I don't know how, I mean,
So RSD creates tiers for special ed students in terms of funding.
okay.
The issue being that there's a lot of debate about whether that funding is sufficient, especially at the levels of more extreme disability.
It would make sense because they're a state entity, that they would abide by the state rules, but that it's just common sense that it would be followed, but it's not law. So there's a hole there. No, I know it's not. I mean, they told me in a meeting on the record that it wasn't being followed, that the money did not follow the child.
And the other difficulty is, even with the normal education kids, they are not offered or given the opportunity, or are passively aggressive delayed in getting evaluated for special educational services. Although, again, by law, they are required to have a special ed evaluation within 60 working days once the request is submitted. Rarely is that happening. They are put off academic year after academic year. And so that is another huge issue, that a lot of children who are skewing your numbers as far as success or not success in LEAP scores and GEEs are children who really have special educational needs who are not getting served.
I was just going to say, I'm not sure that you guys can solve this one, Michael, but it seems like, I mean, what I would think would be a really valuable approach would just be in the state of education each year to, you know, have a section dedicated to special education specifically, so that, you know, there's content, there are questions being asked, not just, you know, that come up, but actually sections of questions being asked around these topics to really expand the report. And that might just help put a brighter light on it and have people pay more attention to it.
I just want to know if the OPSB, because the majority is 20-plus year teachers that are probably approaching retirement, what are their plans for the next 10 years for what their school system is going to look like? Who are they looking at as far as employing new teachers? Are they going to try to take older teachers from the other systems? What's their strategy?
I haven't heard a strategy articulated by the OPSB for that. I think part of that is because of the lack of clarity about the future of governance. So the OPSB is working under the assumption, I think, that they will get a large number of schools back. I don't know that that's a politically realistic assumption, but that's one that they're pushing. And so if that's the case, then that would, you know, sort of bring their teacher corps probably back into balance a little more. But my sense is that they're more worried about the sort of short-term financial issues that they face, and also whether they're going to exist and in what form, you know, in the next 2 to 3 years. So yeah, so as far as I know, there's not a plan for that, but there could be. Do you want to give it to this gentleman?
Yeah. I go to a different school every day to try and get teachers to go back to school to upgrade their credentials, to get master's degrees or national board certification. And I have connections with schools that, with 7 universities that specialize in doing this. And a lot of times I'll go to these schools and I'll get, you know, some schools where teachers are just gung-ho and want to go back because we arrange a financial aid and the funding and admissions paperwork and all of that is done. And then other schools you get where no one's interested in going back and no one's interested in upgrading, and they're just jaded. And I don't know, is that something that you track also, kind of like the qualification level, like, you know, the number of people who are fully certified, the number of people who are master level, and so on? I mean,
it's something that can be followed. We haven't tracked it recently, partly because a lot of the research seems to indicate that the teacher certification is probably in general a good thing, that in terms of what the outcomes are for kids once a teacher has about 3 years of experience, that seems to be the main criteria, and there doesn't seem to be the case that having a master's degree makes a teacher better or worse or other things. That doesn't mean teachers shouldn't pursue master's degrees, but in terms of what the research literature says about what affects student achievement, it doesn't seem like once a teacher has, you know, a lot of the basic credentialing and has a few years of experience under their belt, that increases things a whole lot. So the state does gather that data, and we could definitely find it for you, but I haven't been tracking it recently.
Because I've gone to
oh, I think you might have just hit the off button.
Hello? Okay, anyway, I've been to a lot of schools where you'll go to one where there's a lot of people who are not fully certified, and then I'll go to another one where almost everybody has a master's degree and working on doctorates, you know, and it just, I'm wondering why there would be like a disparity like that as far as who is working where.
Yeah, well, I think when you see that certain systems have, you know, a more concentrated population of very new teachers, those teachers are likely to still be working on their certification. I mean, they have there's some, but so that's why. So in certain schools that are heavily relying on new teachers, that's probably why, because they're getting their certification in the process. Thanks.
Hi, I guess I had sort of a two-part question. I was a student in Lafayette Parish, you know, it's not that far from here, and I remember as a student we would go to school board meetings and be kicked out because we were students and just not allowed to attend. And I found that, you know, speaking to my teachers and to my peers in high school and everything, it was just really frustrating that all of this data is being collected from test scores and from parent opinions and voter opinions, but no one was ever asking the people actually in the system, the students and the teachers, what they thought needed to happen. And I was just wondering if there's anything in the report, data collected from the teachers and students, or if that's even being taken into consideration.
Yeah, so last year we did, so not for this report, if you go to the previous one, which is still on the website, we did a series of youth focus groups, which is interesting. I mean, you get kind of a different type of data, but it is very interesting. And then we also did teacher surveys. We tried to do teacher surveys again this year, but had a problem getting them back, which is more our fault, but you know, it's hard to do. We haven't found a good way to, it's not that there isn't a good way, but we haven't found a sort of cost-effective way, I guess, to really do sort of student surveys. And you sort of have to pick an age range and figure out, you know, you want to get older kids and so on. But I do agree, it's very important that the student voice be heard and certainly the teacher voice be heard. And there are, one thing that is interesting, there are certain groups that have come to fruition, like there's a group called the Fire Youth Squad that we worked with. There's another group called the Rethinkers of middle school kids and high school kids respectively, who get together and who kind of share their experiences with schools. And then in the case of the Rethinkers, they bring that to the superintendent and they say, you know, this is what we want to do. I have no idea why they would kick high school kids out of a school board meeting, it seems like.
They just didn't want to hear what we had.
Okay, so yeah, that I don't know. But that's it's certainly very important. And if anyone's really good at going in and getting, you know, student data, it's important. The other hard thing is actually, for those professors in the audience, you have to get, you know, special approval through the university to talk to minors and who are more protected and so on. So you have to give, it's not impossible by any means, but you just have to give much better reasons for going in and bugging them.
You mentioned $10,000 Louisiana, $15,000 New Orleans present funding. What is the national average, so we know where we stand relative to the rest of the country?
So Louisiana is typically a little below the national average. So I think the national average is around 10K. Tara, do you have a sense of that?
The most recent number I've seen is we were 34th in 2007.
Okay. For expenditures per pupil?
Yeah.
So typically, sorry? 34th. No, sorry. We're 34th among the 51 states plus DC in terms of student funding. So when you look at this, my sense is that in 07, 08, the national average is probably around 10,000. And so Louisiana is typically right around or a little below the national average, just to put that in perspective.
I work with about 16 different school districts in Region 2, and I have a couple of questions for you. How did you define a facility problem? Was it the building? Was it a leaky roof? Was it not enough desks? How did you define that? That's my first question.
So when we talked about facility problems with school leaders, we kind of let them define it. So we did use a sort of open-ended process for our interviews. And so what they come back with in terms of facilities is kind of how we agglomerate the data about our interviews and talk about the larger areas where we see issues. And so they talked about facilities the most. Now, when you talk about that, they put that into several categories. One is school building quality. So the fact that, and I don't have it broken down by who had a leaky roof and so on, but leaky roofs would be one of them. Mold would be another one. Lack of play spaces for children. And then it comes to the control of facilities and trying to deal with who is actually in control of the facilities, who controls maintenance, and also who controls where they will be, which might determine whether they're going to invest in improving the facility or whether they shouldn't because they might move the next year. So I don't have a whole lot of specificity in that sense, but that's how we did it.
And that takes me to my biggest point. What I'm seeing across the board is a real problem with the leadership at the site. They manage the site. Doesn't surprise me that they complain about facilities when that is where a lot of their training has been, is, you know, site management, and not instructional leadership. And I'm interested to what extent you've been looking at the correlation between superior instructional leadership on the part of the administration and complaints about the facility and student performance.
My understanding that Orleans Parish School Board owns the facilities. They have retained ownership of all the facilities. Now, I don't know if they have been budgeted to maintain those facilities, but they have retained ownership of all that property.
But you know, a really good principal makes decisions about facilities based on the overall academic vision of the school. And I have not found a lot of folks with the capacity to put those two things together. That's just a general comment. Thank you.
You want to answer something about that? Or? Yeah, sure. Go crazy.
My name is Tara O'Neill. I'm the policy manager at the Cowen Institute, and as Michael said, facilities, funding, governance, that is something that the whole Cowen Institute focuses on. On the policy side, we've been doing a lot of work on facilities statewide. And really just what I wanted to say was, in Louisiana, there is no state level funding for facilities. We are one of only 9 states in the country where the state provides no facilities funding. The MFP formula, when they kind of established the baseline, they figure out, you know, how much is it going to cost to have a principal and teachers and textbooks and all that stuff. Facilities is not taken into account anywhere. So the Orleans Parish School Board, which does retain ownership of the properties, gets no money for facilities from the MFP. The Recovery School District, which has the responsibility, Recovery School District has all the rights and responsibilities of ownership short of being able to sell or demolish a building. They get no money for facilities. The charter schools get no money for facilities. And that causes problems across the state for us. So that's one of our big issues. We advocate strongly for state level funding for facilities, particularly as a match to encourage local districts to invest more in their facilities. So keep an eye out for us, because that's, you'll hear us talking about that.
States that include that in the MFP, do they at the same time do property taxes that are designated to their local educational institutions? Do you find that they kind of pick and choose?
No, most of them have both. I mean, the locals, I think in every state where there's state level funding, the locals will also have property taxes that go toward the maintenance and operation of schools and buildings as well. So.
Prior to Katrina, OPSB students, middle and high school students, were carried by RTA. This is not the case now, so the students have to be carried by yellow buses. Has consideration been given to executing a new agreement with the RTA to carry school kids to reduce the transportation costs?
I don't know whether that's been thought about. I think there's been two kind of problems that come up when that, and that is mentioned, that a lot of students took RTA. One is that RTA is below capacity, so a lot of the routes they had are not there. But the main problem, I think, is that students are, for the most part, not attending schools in their neighborhoods. So it's unlikely that an RTA route is going to get you from the east to Uptown or from the West Bank to Gentilly. Or, you know, there's just so many more permutations of where kids need to get from and go to than what a typical regional transit, you know, or the bus routes and streetcars would normally have. That, though in some cases that might work, and that's a good thing to suggest.
RTA has not basically reestablished all of its routes. Some of the routes are not in operation. However, if an agreement is reached with the school board or recovery school or OPSB, then RTA could put back some of those routes that are not in operation now to fill out more of the system and give the students a choice. It's just
No, I think it's definitely a good idea. I just think that it'll only fill sort of part of that hole, but you're correct, it will help.
I also wanted to say something about the expenditures per pupil, and I have a question for you. Now, in the time of budget cuts, have you ever come across schools saying that they are cutting programs like they did, for instance, in California? Many schools have cut language programs, German language programs, French language programs, in order to have enough money to fix the leaking roof or to have enough money to bring the students from one place to the other. Have you come across some of these issues?
Well, the RSD has definitely cut social workers. It's cut other ancillary, I shouldn't say ancillary, but other non-teaching staff to save money. And they've also increased class sizes. So those are the two main things that I've seen in terms of cost savings. I think as this trend increases and they sort of hit that funding cliff more, it is very possible that, you know, especially any program that's not essentially mandated by state law or as part of the accountability system, foreign language might be one of them, could be cut. But so far we've heard mostly increased class sizes and unfortunately in some cases mental health service or things like that. And in some cases central office staff of varying types.
I'm not really well versed in New Orleans education systems at all, but I was wondering if there was any data collected with regards to the ratio of students that do go to charter schools or to public schools versus those that just don't go to school at all, and how is the Cowen Institute or the OPSB or the NSD trying to mitigate like delinquent behavior, or maybe it's because it's not in their neighborhood, and how are they trying to get them into schools?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. You know, truancy, so the idea that the kids who are of school age who are not going to school, anecdotally is a big problem in New Orleans. There's not good data on it. The most you might be able to get is something like looking at attendance, but it's possible the kids were never on the rolls in the first place, in which case attendance wouldn't help you get at truancy either. This is kind of one problem where a lack of a clear governance structure can sometimes hurt because it's not clear who's ultimately accountable for ensuring those kids are in school. Sometimes it might be law enforcement, sometimes it might be a district, but in the case of two districts and lots of charter schools, it's not clear. There's also some anecdotal evidence that, you know, well, this is a little bit different from truancy, but could relate to it, that the further that kids have to go to school, the more likely they are to be absent. We don't know that for sure, but it's a strong likelihood, and anecdotally we've heard that. So one thing that you know, we've talked about and other people have talked about is that if the mayor is trying to think about how, the new mayor is trying to think about how he can sort of support public education, it might be to fill that gap of who's ultimately accountable for ensuring kids are in school, either through social services or through some hopefully not too terrible aspect of law enforcement to ensure that kids are getting into schools. But that requires syncing up with the school system, which is not easy because there's no one person or entity that's just in charge of the school system. So the answer is there's not a lot of data, unfortunately, and I think that governance makes it difficult to sort of figure out who's accountable for that issue.
believe it or not, some of the schools are encouraging parents to put their kids into homeschooling. And again, my population of children, that's very frequently being told to parents, your child would be best served by your doing homeschooling with them. And so there is becoming a greater population of those children who are not going to school, who ostensibly are in homeschools and are under some sort of state approval for that.
Great. Any other questions? And I'd be happy to talk to folks afterwards. Yeah, Pat, do you want to?
There's a huge amount of research about libraries in schools and the fact that a library can be the heart of a school. And I wonder if you've looked at all at, I don't know whether I need this. If you have looked at all at how many schools have libraries, what are the collections like, and how many of them have librarians and or certified librarians? Or how would one even begin to get that data?
I really don't know that. I think that the current facility situation probably makes it rough in terms of schools with libraries. So anecdotally, I know of, several schools that are in modulars, some of whom have created mini reading rooms, quasi-libraries, but don't really have libraries and certainly don't have a librarian. I think the other thing is that a lot of schools are much smaller now than they used to be, and a lot of charter schools are starting small. So typically, they don't yet, in their minds, have the economy of scale yet to hire a librarian. So my guess would be fewer schools, but I have not looked at that. Could definitely. I mean, I think that I will say that I'm pretty sure in the building plans for the new schools, they are including libraries. I mean, they're pretty much doing state of the art for most of the design, so it should have libraries. But I think that right now a lot of schools don't. But I will look into that. I know she would.
Actually, to be approved now for they do require certain specifications now, and depending on the level of school, whether secondary or elementary, they require major libraries.
What kind of programs are available for English language learners? I know it's difficult for charter schools to be able to service all populations and subgroups, but what is going on in the RSD in Orleans Parish and in individual charter schools for English language learners? And are those, if there are, do you have services, is there a push for certification for those teachers, or how does that?
I frankly don't know a lot about ELL. I think part of it is that though there is a slightly larger Latino population in schools now than before the storm, it's still very, very small, and a lot of the Latino kids are concentrated in Jefferson Parish. But that said, I don't know kind of what programs currently exist. I know there's one charter school that's sort of aimed at Latino students, Esperanza Charter School, but in other schools, my sense is that because many are smaller or small and growing, that they don't have that specialty.
They live in Orleans Parish, but I work in Jefferson Parish, and we have over 4,000 ELLs in Jefferson Parish, so I can't imagine we wouldn't have a equal number in Orleans, or close to that. I can't imagine they'd all be in Jefferson Parish.
My sense is it's a relatively small population in Orleans, but I can certainly check on that.
Came in late, so I hope I'm not repeating something you said. But with the cut in LA4, what's the state of pre-K in the schools?
State of pre-K is not good. I mean, I think essentially, I don't know what schools plan to do. So just so people know, LA4 is the Louisiana's 4-year-old pre-K program. It's a pretty well-regarded program. It's been evaluated. It's been shown to have a good effect, and it's been cut pretty significantly in this year. I know that a lot of charter schools are considering whether they can afford to run it, and I think the districts, I don't know what the districts are doing, but essentially the answer is that a lot of schools feel like it's essentially a hole in their budget because they don't get enough per kid to provide the services that LA4 requires them to provide to be certified to provide LA4. So it's kind of this conundrum of a legislative, requirement for how you provide LA4 without enough money to do it. So I think that, for right now, schools are still trying to provide it, but I know anecdotally of a number of schools that are thinking about cutting it next year, which is not a good thing. Do you know anything about it? That's all I know.
I have one more question regarding the academically unacceptable status that you mentioned earlier. And looking into the brochure, there were about 60% of schools prior to the storm were academically unacceptable. Now it's only 42%. Is this unacceptable rate, does this stand in any relation to the teachers who are maybe not yet certified but are working? I'm looking at another chart, like there are 32% at the RSD charter schools, teachers with no experience or 1 year of experience. Do you have any numbers if there is a relation between the unexperienced teachers or non-certified teachers and the unacceptable academic status of the schools?
Not in that close of a connection. I mean, in general, when there have been evaluations of new teacher certification programs, the alternative certification programs that a lot of new teachers go through, they've actually been found to be quite good. That said, I think any school that has, you know, such a huge concentration of new teachers could face significant problems. But my sense is that there's not a direct connection, and certainly now in the RSD, many of the schools that are not doing so well have increasingly more veteran teachers, and maybe that will help, but there doesn't seem to be a strong correlation between the two. Though I do get the sense that veteran principals who are now taking more control over hiring at RSD run schools are hiring more veteran teachers. So that does seem to be their approach. But in general, I haven't seen a correlation. It's also a relatively small group of population of schools, so it's hard to get, you know, direct statistical links. But you know. All right, maybe one more, and a few more. We can wrap up.
So I'm a med student at Tulane, and I'm just curious what the education is now about HIV awareness and maybe even nutrition, as far as, because I don't know if you know this, but New Orleans is, I think, #3 for highest incidence for HIV.
Yeah. Did you say nutrition as well? Or HIV? Or both? Do you know anything about that? Yeah, you guys are asking the hardest questions I've ever had. No, you know, again, my sense is that there's not, I don't know. Do you? Okay, great.
They actually have health clinics that they
Right.
run, as well as LSU, so there is some education along the way. There's also a mobile van that's going both within Orleans Parish and St. Bernard Parish, providing primary care as well as some education.
Yeah.
But as far as focusing on those particular issues per se, probably not.
And I guess I know of no official state curriculum. It might exist, but I know of no official state curriculum that ensures that every student gets, you know, a certain amount of information about HIV.
HIV and sex ed, you know, folks I've spoken to have felt that the state mandated curriculum is definitely lacking.
I had a half unit of health that was entirely nutrition based. I never actually had sex ed or sexual health ed.
One more, and then we can wrap up, and I'd be happy to talk to anyone afterwards. Is there one over here?
Yeah, shortly after Katrina, most of these school districts filled their teaching rosters with basically whatever was available, I guess would be the quickest way to say it. Quite often alternative certified teachers. My question is, with the rapid turnaround of those teachers and teachers in general, has there been any kind of expression of strategy in terms of where they're going to continue to get their teaching pool?
Yeah, that's a good question. This is kind of one thing that makes me bring up the data question, is I have no data on teacher turnover. I mean, anecdotally, I know from what you're saying and from talking to people that there's a high level of teacher turnover. The one thing you'll see in the recovery school district is that turnover from the very first years has actually led to more experienced teachers coming back into the system. Though again, I don't know if they're coming from the old system or if they're coming from Texas, or, you know, I don't know where they're coming from. In terms of a long-term strategy, again, like with the question about the OPSB, it is very expensive to constantly recruit new teachers and obviously to train and so on. And I think because of the kind of bifurcation of the system and decentralization of the system, individual charter schools have, you know, various strategies they're using to recruit teachers and retain teachers, but I'm not familiar with, say, the Recovery School District having, you know, a set human capital plan like that, or in this case, the OPSB. So I don't know of one. Does that answer your question? All right, well, thank you all very much for really good, hard questions that I often didn't have the answer to. And I'd be happy to talk to anyone afterwards.